Hello, I'm Janine Turner, founder of Constituting America. Welcome to our annual scholastic study. History holds the key to the future, or as Shakespeare said, the past is prelude. This year's study is entitled The Genius of America, A Journey into Our Republic, a study on Alexis De Tocqueville's Democracy in America. In his first volume, De Tocqueville was somewhat prophetic. Almost a decade and a half before the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, he predicted conflict between the two countries. Troy Kickler. This essay is entitled Volume 1 Conclusion, Democracy in America, Conclusion 1, by Troy Kickler. A political scientist, historian, and politician, Alexis De Tocqueville, 1805 through 1859, traveled the United States in 1831. He and fellow traveler Gustave de Beaumont spent 9 months traversing the expanse of the 1830s United States. They wanted to learn more concerning the young nation. Their observations were published in 2 volumes titled Democracy in America. The first volume was published in 1835 and the second in 1840. Even though de Tocqueville identified America as a, quote, Republican government, end quote, he remained impressed by the nation's democratic features. That is, America had more equal social conditions than its European counterparts. Although more than a few modern-day Americans might disagree, de Tocqueville remarked that all had a, quote, similar condition, end quote, and held onto common, quote, customs and opinions to which social conditions has given birth, end quote. The Frenchman begins his conclusion to Volume 1 by reminding readers not to let the particulars distract from the whole. In other words, some people cannot see the forest because of the trees. For starters, he considers the United States a, quote, magnificent inheritance, end quote, and he regrets that his native country did not establish a significant stronghold in North America. In his first volume, de Tocqueville was somewhat prophetic. Almost a decade and a half before the Mexican-American War, 1846 through 1848, he predicted conflict between the two countries. There was a lot of what de Tocqueville described as, quote, uninhabited land, end quote, in the West. He anticipated the, quote, Anglo-Americans, end quote, to take, quote, possession of the soil and establish such institutions, end quote, that newcomers and legal owners would eventually find the land, quote, quietly settled, end quote. Americans were what de Tocqueville called, quote, swift pioneers, end quote. In particular, he discussed the American settlement of Texas. He erroneously thought that all Mexicans would be removed from Texas. The Tejano experience, for one, did not occur to him. He also predicted disagreements between America and Russia, even before the Cold War and current events. In 1831, the two nations to him were sleeping giants who had remained off of Europe's radar. A lengthy quote is illustrative. Remember, this viewpoint was expressed in the 1830s. Quote, there are 2 great peoples on the earth today, the Russians and the Anglo-Americans. Both of them have grown larger in obscurity, and while men's regards were occupied elsewhere, they have suddenly taken their place in the first rank of nations, and the whole world has learned of their birth and of their greatness almost at the same time, end quote. De Tocqueville believed most other nations' growth had stopped. Not so for the United States and Russia. According to the Frenchman, the nations achieved greatness by different means. The Americans struggled against nature's obstacles, while the Russians confronted men. In de Tocqueville's estimation, the American conquest was via the plowshare, while the Russians conquered by the sword. Although de Tocqueville foretold that both nations would eventually, quote, sway the destinies of half the globe, end quote, America and Russia had different means to greatness. The Atlantic Ocean divided England from the United States. With a French perspective, de Tocqueville refers to, quote, Anglo-Americans, end quote, yet he did so in a positive way. De Tocqueville is redundant during the last few pages of the conclusion, though, but in essence, he writes, quote, the Anglo-Americans relies on personal interest and allows the force and reason of individuals to act without directing them. The second, in a way, concentrates all the power of society in one man. The one has freedom for his principal means of action, the other servitude. Remember, de Tocqueville observed American culture in 1831. His report, the first volume, was published in 1835. The Atlantic Ocean divided England from the United States. De Tocqueville believed and hoped Anglo-Americans would identify with those across the ocean as more similar than different. In sum, despite prior differences between the two nations, resulting in prior actual and diplomatic wars, he forecasted that industrialization and technology and transportation improvements would unite rather than divide the two countries. This essay was written by Troy Kickler. Troy Kickler is founding director of the North Carolina History Project and editor of NorthCarolinaHistory.org. He holds an MS in Social Studies Education from North Carolina A&T State University and a PhD in History from the University of Tennessee.